3 hard knocks shook my door. They didn't sound like a friendly visit. They sounded like a verdict. I was in my office. A small room at the back of my house that looked out onto a quiet garden. The only sounds were the soft click of my keyboard and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I had been working for 10 hours straight, finalizing a proposal for a new commercial development. The numbers on the screen were clean and orderly. They made sense. They added up. My life, for the most part, felt the same way. Quiet. Orderly. Mine. The knocks came again. Louder this time. Impatient. I sighed and pushed my chair back. I knew who it was. No one else in the world knocked on my door with that much entitlement. I walked through my silent house, my bare feet cold on the hardwood floors. I took a deep breath before I turned the handle, bracing myself not for a fight, but for a performance. When I opened it, my father, Robert Vance, stood there. He was a man who took up more space than his body required. His suit was expensive. His expression was grim. And in his hand, he held a sleek leather folder full of numbers that I knew would be messy and arrogant. He looked at me not as a daughter, but as a resource. "Elena," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. It was the same voice he used to close deals and intimidate junior partners. "Dad," I replied. My tone was perfectly even. I didn't invite him in. Behind him, my sister Chloe hovered. She was a master of looking fragile with her big doe eyes and a talent for making her problems seem like delicate tragedies. Today, she had outdone herself. She looked like a wilting flower, her hand clutching my father's arm as if she might collapse without his support. She was wearing a coat I probably paid for. "We need to talk," my father said, pushing past me into the foyer. He didn't wait for an invitation. He never did. Chloe scurried in behind him, avoiding my eyes. He walked straight into my living room and placed the folder on my glass coffee table. The sound was a sharp crack in the silence. He stood over it. A general surveying a battlefield, he was certain he would win. "I need the money tomorrow," he ordered. He opened the folder. Inside were statements, letters, and demands. Chaos printed in black and white. $800,000. Chloe's debt. There can be no delays. 800,000. The number just hung there in the air. Obscene and absurd. I didn't react. I had learned long ago that reacting gave him power. I looked past him at my sister. She finally met my gaze, her eyes welling up with practiced tears. "Please, Elena," she whispered. The whisper was the deadliest part of their act. It was designed to make me feel like the cruel one, the one with the cold heart. It was meant to trigger a lifetime of guilt. For years, it had worked. My father saw me looking at her and his jaw tightened. "This isn't a negotiation," he said. "This is family." Justin lost his job. They fell behind. It spiraled. He made it sound like a natural disaster, like a flood or a fire. Unavoidable. blameless. But I could see the names on the credit card statements from across the room. High-end designers, luxury resorts, restaurants I knew charged $500 a plate. This wasn't a spiral. This was a nosedive flown with style. I walked over to the table and looked down at the papers. I saw loan agreements, gambling losses from an online account in Justin's name, and a second mortgage on their house. A house I had given them the down payment for as a wedding gift. A gift that was supposed to give them a start, not a line of credit. At the bottom of one of the loan applications, I saw my father's signature as a cosigner. He had guaranteed their debt, knowing full well he had no intention of paying it himself. He was guaranteeing it with my money. He was guaranteeing it with my future. He expected me to be angry. He was prepared for a fight. A fight would end with Chloe crying, him yelling about loyalty, and me eventually writing a check to make it all stop. That was the familiar dance. But I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt. I felt nothing at all. It was the strange hollow calm that comes when you confirm a truth you've always known but never wanted to admit. The machine was just operating as designed. I was the emergency fund. I was the fail-safe. I was the one who was strong enough to bear the weight of their weakness. I looked up from the papers and met my father's hard gaze. Then I looked at Chloe, who was now twisting a tissue in her hands. She looked so small. It was an illusion she had perfected over 30 years. I felt a small, strange curve at the edge of my lips. It wasn't quite a real smile. It was just enough to make him nervous. He shifted his weight, his confidence wavering for a fraction of a second. He didn't know what to do with my quiet. He only knew how to handle my resistance. "Okay," I said. The word was so simple, so quiet. It landed in the room and absorbed all the tension. Chloe let out a shaky breath of relief. My father's shoulders relaxed, a smug look of victory settling on his face. He had won. He always won. "Good," he said, snapping the folder shut. "I'll send you the wire information in the morning. Don't be late." He turned and walked to the door. Chloe followed, stopping for a moment to look back at me. "Thank you, Elena," she said, her voice thick with what she probably thought was gratitude. "You're saving us." I just nodded. I watched them walk down the path to their expensive car, my father's arm protectively around Chloe's shoulders, shielding the fragile one from a world that was only hard because they refused to be strong. I closed the door and locked it. The silence of the house rushed back in. But it was different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was empty. I stood there for a long time, just breathing in, out. Then I walked back to the coffee table and looked at the leather folder. It felt like a tombstone, a marker for the person I used to be. 4 hours later, I was standing in the fluorescent hum of the international airport. I had one small suitcase, my laptop, and a purse. I had no destination in mind, only a resolve that was as hard and clear as glass. I wasn't running away from them. I was rewriting the story. And in this version, I was no longer the villain or the savior. I was just gone, Growing up, I learned that in our house, love was conditional. It wasn't a blanket that kept you warm. It was a reward you earned. The rules were simple. If Chloe cried, my father fixed it. If I succeeded, he called it showing off. There were two roles available in the Vance family: the fragile one and the strong one. The roles were assigned early and they were permanent. I remember when I was 10 and Chloe was 8. She wanted a new bicycle for her birthday. A specific pink one with streamers. My father spent weeks searching for it. When he finally found it, he presented it to her like a crown jewel. Her smile was his reward. That same month, I won the state-level science fair. My project was on thermodynamics, and I had worked on it for months. Staying late after school, reading books from the library until my head ached. When I came home with the blue ribbon and a small trophy, I set it on the kitchen table for him to see. He glanced at it when he came in from work. "Another one," he said, loosening his tie. "Don't you think you're overdoing it? Elena, it's good to be smart, but nobody likes a show-off." He never asked about the project. He never read the summary. The trophy sat on the table for 3 days before I quietly took it to my room and put it in the back of my closet. I learned my lesson. My achievements were not a source of pride for him. They were a burden. They made Chloe feel bad. And nothing was more important than protecting Chloe's feelings. When our mother died, I was 16. She was the buffer, the soft place in our family. Her death didn't break my father. It hardened him. He didn't shatter. He redirected all his focus, all his need for control toward protecting the fragile one. Chloe cried for weeks and he held her. He took her out of school. He bought her a pony. He catered to her grief. I didn't cry. Not where he could see, anyway. I grieved in my room late at night. A pillow pressed against my face. I handled the casseroles from neighbors. I made sure the bills were paid from my mom's checking account. I organized the funeral announcements. I was strong, and so I was ignored. My grief was an inconvenience. My father needed me to be the stable pillar so he could devote all his energy to propping up the leaning one. That dynamic never changed. It just grew with us. I became the provider, the emergency fund, the silent rescuer. It started small. When Chloe was in college, she called me crying because she had overdrawn her account and couldn't afford her textbooks. "Don't tell Dad," she'd pleaded. "He'll be so disappointed in me." So, I wired her the money. It became a pattern. Car repairs, rent, a spring break trip she swore was for networking. Each time, it was a secret. A little conspiracy between us that kept her image perfect in our father's eyes and solidified my role as the invisible support beam. I paid for my own college education with scholarships and 2 part-time jobs. I graduated top of my class in business and started my own financial consulting firm by the time I was 25. I was good with money because I had to be. I knew its value because I had earned every single dollar myself. My success, however, was treated like a public utility. When Chloe wanted to buy a house with her new husband, Justin, They couldn't get approved for a loan. I didn't just give them the down payment. I bought the house under my LLC and created a rent-to-own agreement for them with terms so generous they were practically a gift. It was cleaner that way. I told myself it was a business transaction. But it wasn't. It was just another link in the chain. My father praised me for my generosity. "That's what family does," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. The strong look after the weak. He said it like a compliment, but it felt like a life sentence. Then came the wedding. Chloe wanted a fairy tale. My father wanted to give it to her. But his own finances were a tangled mess of risky investments and lifestyle spending. So the expectation fell on me. The venue. The couture dress. The 10-tier cake. I paid for it all quietly. Legally through my company. To the world. It looked like my father was the generous patriarch throwing a lavish party for his beloved daughter. Only a few people knew the truth. Every check I signed felt like I was erasing a little piece of myself. I was no longer Elena Vance, the successful businesswoman. I was just a function. A solution. A walking, talking bank account with a family obligation attached. My father's favorite phrase was, "family first." He said it at every holiday dinner, every birthday. But he never meant the family as a whole. He meant the family hierarchy. He meant that my needs, my money, my future came second to Chloe's wants. I was first in line to sacrifice, but last in line to receive. I wasn't a daughter. I was an asset. And tonight, when he stood in my living room and demanded nearly $1 million, he wasn't asking for help. He was cashing in on his investment. The price of being the strong one had finally become too high. After they left, I didn't move for a long time. I just stood in the middle of my living room, listening to the silence. The house felt huge and empty. On the coffee table, the leather folder sat like a black hole, absorbing all the light in the room. I felt a strange pull toward it. The same morbid curiosity that makes you look at the scene of an accident. I needed to see the damage up close. I made myself a cup of tea, my hands moving on autopilot. I carried the warm mug back to the couch and sat down, placing it carefully on a coaster. I stared at the folder for another minute, then reached out and opened it. The first page was a summary. A neatly typed letter from a law firm whose name I recognized as one of the most aggressive debt collectors in the state. The letter was addressed to my father, Robert Vance, and to Mr. and Mrs. Justin Pierce. It was a final demand for payment before legal action. The amount at the bottom was $812,462. My father hadn't even told me the full amount. He'd rounded down as if that made the demand more reasonable. I started to go through the papers one by one. It was a roadmap of terrible decisions. There were 6 different credit cards, all maxed out. I looked through the itemized statements. It was a blur of designer names: Gucci, Prada, Louis Vuitton. There were charges from spas in Arizona, 5-star hotels in Miami, and a jewelry store in New York for a single purchase of over $30,000. It was a highlight reel of a life I wasn't just funding. but one I myself would never live. I was too practical, too busy working. Then I found the casino statements. They were from an offshore gambling site linked to Justin's name. The losses were staggering. Thousands of dollars lost in a single night. Night after night. He had been chasing his losses, digging the hole deeper and deeper with each desperate bet. And Chloe had been right there with him, masking their panic with $1,000 handbags. The worst part was the loan agreements. They had taken out a second mortgage on their house, the house I had helped them buy. They had borrowed against my gift. They had taken a foundation and turned it into collateral for their chaos. The interest rate was predatory. They must have been desperate. And on the bottom of that agreement, right next to Chloe's and Justin's signatures, was my father's, Robert Vance. Co-signer. Guarantor. He had signed his name, pledging to cover their debt if they failed. But I knew what his signature really meant. It wasn't his own assets he was pledging. It was mine. He had walked into that bank, looked that loan officer in the eye, and signed a promise he fully expected me to keep. He had used his name to leverage my money. It was the ultimate betrayal. It wasn't just enabling his favored daughter. It was a calculated business decision. He had assessed the risk, looked at his assets, looked at my assets, and decided it was a safe bet because he had me. I was his ultimate insurance policy. I felt a coldness spread through my chest. The outline said I wasn't angry, and that was true. Anger is a hot, messy emotion. This was something different. It was the cold, hard clarity of a final answer. For years, I had told myself a story. The story was that my father loved me, but he was worried about Chloe. That he relied on me because he was proud of my strength. That our family was dysfunctional. Yes, but held together by a complicated love. That story was a lie. This folder was the truth. The truth was that I was not a daughter to him. I was a tool. My success was not a source of pride. It was a resource to be exploited. He didn't love me for my strength. He valued me for my utility. He had raised one daughter to be a princess and the other to be a workhorse to pay for the castle. He expected me to bend the way I always did. He expected tears, arguments, and then finally submission. He expected a transfer of funds in the morning and a strained family dinner next Sunday where we would all pretend this never happened. He expected me to absorb this crisis just like I had absorbed all the others. He would tell me it was for family. He would use the word love like a weapon. He would try to wrap this transaction in a lifetime of guilt. But looking at the cold, hard numbers, I felt nothing. The guilt was gone. The obligation was gone. All those years of trying to earn his approval, of hoping he would finally see me, felt foolish. He had always seen me. He had seen me as exactly what I was to him. A solution to a problem. I closed the folder. The show was over. The performance had ended. I didn't have to play my part anymore. I wasn't angry. I was done. By midnight, the decision had crystallized. It wasn't a frantic, emotional choice made in anger. It was a calm, logical conclusion. It was a business decision. The family business had become a bad investment, and it was time to divest. I went into my office, the same room where I built my success, and sat down at my desk. The proposal I had been working on was still on the screen. A project built on logic, structure, and clear boundaries. My life needed the same. My first call was to Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was more than just my attorney. She was my oldest friend. We had met in college. Two scholarship kids trying to navigate a world we weren't born into. She had seen my family's dynamic up close. She had been the one I called after every holiday, every birthday, every new financial emergency. She had listened for years. Her advice always the same. You can't set yourself on fire to keep them warm. Elena. She answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep. This better be good. It's me, I said. There was a pause and I could hear her sit up in bed. What did he do now? She asked, suddenly wide awake. He came to my house with Chloe. They need $800,000 by tomorrow. I heard her exhale slowly. It was a sound of weary resignation. So, another Tuesday, she said dryly. Then her tone shifted. It became sharp, focused. What did you say? I said. Okay. For a moment, there was only silence on the line. Then her voice came back soft and hopeful. Tell me you're finally doing it, Elena. Tell me you're done. I'm done financing their chaos, I replied, my voice steady. I need your help. I want to cut them off completely. Legally. Quietly. I've had the paperwork ready for 5 years, she said without hesitation. Give me an hour. I'll email you everything you need to sign electronically. We'll start with revoking his power of attorney over the joint investment account. I had forgotten about that. An account I had set up years ago for my father's retirement with him as a beneficiary and with limited POA in case of a medical emergency. He had clearly seen it as just another part of my portfolio that he was entitled to. Let's do it, I said. All of it. Within the hour, my inbox was full of documents, with Sarah on the phone guiding me through the legal jargon. I began to dismantle the financial prison I had built for myself. Every click of the mouse was a snip of the wires that held me to them. First, the trusts. The trust that held the title to Chloe's house was immediately transferred to a new holding company, one my father had no knowledge of. The trust I had established for his own retirement was frozen. He wouldn't be able to touch a dime without my explicit notarized consent. Next, the accounts. His shared access to my primary investment portfolio was revoked. His name was scrubbed from everything. I moved the majority of my liquid assets into a new private account at a different bank, one he couldn't trace. The process was quiet, digital, and complete. I was using the very skills he had always dismissed as showing off to create a firewall he would never be able to breach. My competence was now my shield. When the financial separation was complete, I started on the box. I found a plain brown shipping box in my closet. I went through my files, pulling copies of every major transaction. A copy of the cashier's check for Chloe's college tuition, the deed transfer for their house, invoices from the wedding planner, the caterer, the florist, all marked paid in full by my LLC. I printed out bank statements showing the dozens of smaller transfers over the years, the ones for car trouble and credit card debt. I screenshotted every pleading text message from Chloe, every demanding email from my father. Each piece of paper was a receipt for a piece of my life I had given away. Piling them in the box felt like reclaiming them. It was a physical manifestation of my silent sacrifice. Then I found what I was looking for. A copy of the authorization form my father had used 3 years ago to draw from our joint account to cover one of his bad investments. He had told me he would sign for me since I was traveling. I looked at the signature in my name. It was a decent forgery, good enough to get past a bank teller who wasn't paying attention. At the time, I had let it go. It was easier than starting a fight. Now it was evidence. I placed everything in the box. On top of the pile, I put a small USB drive. It contained digital copies of everything, plus a recording of a voicemail he'd left me last year, telling me to be a good daughter and handle Chloe's latest financial mess. Finally, I took a single sheet of notepaper and wrote a short, simple note. My handwriting was clear and steady. You said family comes first. Maybe honesty should come before that. I folded the note and placed it on top of the USB drive. I sealed the box with packing tape. It was heavy. It felt as heavy as my entire adult life. I walked to the front door and placed the box on the porch, right where they would be sure to see it when they came back tomorrow. Expecting a check? My plan was quiet, legal, and complete. There would be no dramatic confrontation, no screaming match. My departure from their lives would be as silent and efficient as one of my business transactions. I didn't sleep. After the box was packed and the accounts were secured, I walked through my house. It was a beautiful house filled with things I had chosen and paid for. It was my sanctuary. But tonight it felt like a cage gilded with the profits of my unending servitude. I touched the cool marble of the kitchen island, ran my hand along the soft leather of the sofa. These were the rewards for being the strong one, and I was willing to leave them all behind. I packed one suitcase. Practical things. Jeans. Sweaters. A few good books. My laptop. I left the expensive clothes in the closet, the jewelry in its box. I was shedding a skin and I wanted to travel light. The person I was becoming didn't need those things. At 4:30 the morning, I called a car service. The city was still dark and quiet as we drove toward the airport. The familiar skyline, usually a source of pride for me, looked alien. The towering buildings felt like monuments to a life that was no longer mine. I watched them in the rearview mirror until they were just a faint glow against the dark sky. I felt no sadness, no nostalgia, just a quiet sense of forward motion. The airport was a cavern of hushed calm at that hour. The usual chaos hadn't begun. The few people there walked with a quiet purpose. I felt anonymous and the feeling was a relief. I was not a sister or a daughter here. I was not a solution to anyone's problem. I was just a woman with a suitcase. I walked up to the departures board. A huge screen displaying 100 different futures. My eyes scanned the list of cities. Paris, London, Tokyo. For a moment, I was tempted, but I wasn't looking for an escape into noise and distraction. I was looking for quiet. I was looking for a place where the landscape was bigger than my problems. My eyes landed on a name, Portland, Maine. From there, I knew I could get a car and drive up the coast. I thought of pictures I had seen online. Rocky shorelines, crashing waves, evergreen forests that smelled of pine. A place where nature was loud and people were quiet. It felt right. A one-way ticket to Portland, Maine. Please, I said to the agent at the counter. She smiled politely, her fingers tapping on the keyboard. One way, she confirmed. Yes, I said, the words feeling solid and real. One way. I found my gate and sat down, watching the sky slowly lighten from black to a soft pre-dawn gray. I bought a coffee and drank it slowly, feeling the warmth spread through me. I didn't check my phone. I didn't need to. I knew what was happening. My father was waking up, confident. Chloe was probably sleeping in, relieved. They were living in their last few hours of blissful ignorance. They believed I was at home, preparing to transfer the money, preparing to fall back in line. When they called my flight for boarding, I stood up and walked down the jet bridge without a single look back. I found my window seat and buckled myself in. The mundane clicks and announcements of the pre-flight routine were comforting. They were the sounds of a system that worked, of a journey with a clear beginning and end. The plane taxied onto the runway and paused. For a moment, everything was still. I looked out the window at the sprawling city now waking up below. A city full of my history. A city full of their expectations. Then the engines roared to life. The plane surged forward, pressing me back into my seat. The speed was exhilarating. And then came the moment of lift. That impossible feeling of leaving the earth behind. The ground fell away, and the city shrank into a map of itself. The buildings that had seemed so imposing were now just tiny squares. The highways were just gray lines. Everything that had felt so heavy, so suffocating, was now small and distant. As the plane climbed through the clouds and into the bright, clean sunlight, I finally exhaled. It was a breath I felt like I had been holding for my entire life. It was a release of pressure, of obligation, of a weight I had forgotten I was even carrying. For years, I had been their safety net, always there to catch them when they fell. Now I was the consequence, the empty space where the net used to be. And for the first time, I felt truly, completely free. I was 1,400 miles away, sitting on the small, wind-beaten porch of a rented cottage in Maine. The air smelled of salt and pine. In my hand, I held a warm mug of coffee, and on the small table beside me, my phone was propped up, displaying a live feed from my doorbell camera. It was exactly 12 Eastern Time, I knew he would be on time. Punctuality was a form of control, and my father was nothing if not controlling. Right on schedule. His black sedan pulled up to the curb. The car itself was a statement. A sleek, aggressive machine that cost more than most people's homes. He got out, adjusting his suit jacket, his movements stiff with anger. Chloe slid out of the passenger side. Even on the grainy camera feed, she looked like a mess. Her hair was unkempt and her face was puffy from crying. Her fragility, once a weapon, now just looked like genuine exhaustion. My father marched up the stone walkway, Chloe trailing a few steps behind him. He didn't knock. He pounded on the door with the side of his fist, the sound echoing through my phone's speaker. "Elena, open up. We had a deal," he yelled. His voice was laced with the familiar tone of command. But underneath it, I could hear a tremor of panic. The money hadn't arrived. His perfect solution had failed. He pounded again. Harder this time. "Elena, this is not a game. You said okay." Chloe wrung her hands, looking around nervously as if the neighbors might be watching. "Dad, maybe she's not home," she said, her voice thin and reedy. "She's home," he growled. "She's just trying to make a point." It was then that he saw it. The plain brown box sitting just to the side of the welcome mat. He stopped, his fist still raised. He stared at it for a long moment. Chloe peered around him, her expression one of confusion. "What's that?" she asked. My father didn't answer. He bent down cautiously as if the box might be a trap and lifted it. He shook it gently, then set it on the porch railing and tore at the packing tape. His movements were rough, impatient. He pulled back the flaps and looked inside. From my vantage point, I couldn't see his face clearly, only the back of his head and his rigid shoulders. He reached in and pulled out the first stack of papers. They were the receipts from Chloe's shopping sprees. He flipped through them, his movements slowing. He pulled out the next stack. The wedding invoices. Then the deed to their house with my LLC's name printed in stark, clear letters. I watched him stand there motionless for what felt like an eternity. He was processing. He was seeing for the first time the full documented cost of his expectations. He was seeing my 30 years of silence, quantified and itemized. Chloe stepped closer. "Dad, what is it?" He ignored her. He reached back into the box and pulled out the copy of the authorization form, the one with his forgery of my signature. He held it up, the single sheet of paper trembling slightly in his hand. This was the one. The proof that his control had crossed the line into crime. It was the receipt for his ultimate betrayal. Finally, his hand found the small USB drive. He looked at it, confused. Then he saw the small portable Bluetooth speaker I had left on the porch table, fully charged. He was a man who understood technology. He knew what to do. With a few fumbling movements, he connected the drive. A moment of static. And then my voice filled the quiet afternoon air. It was calm, steady, and devoid of emotion. It was the voice I used for business presentations. "Dad," my voice said from the speaker. "For years, you told me my greatest assets were my intelligence and my work ethic. You were right. You taught me how to build a portfolio, how to leverage assets, and how to cut losses on a bad investment. You taught me control, but you never taught me compassion for myself. This isn't revenge. It's a receipt for a debt that was never mine to pay." The recording ended. The only sound was a bird chirping somewhere down the street. He froze. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was a quiet internal crumbling. His shoulders, which had been so square and confident, slumped. The arrogance drained from his face, leaving behind the tired, wrinkled mask of an old man. The illusion of his power, the foundation upon which he had built his entire life, cracked. He looked down at the papers in his hand, not as a king surveying his kingdom, but as a man reading his own obituary. Chloe just stared at the speaker, her mouth slightly open. The mascara smudges on her cheeks were now stark against her pale skin. She wasn't just guilty anymore. She was implicated. He slowly, methodically put every piece of paper back into the box. He closed the flaps. He didn't look at the door again. He turned, walked back to his car, and drove away, leaving Chloe standing alone on the porch with the wreckage of their lives. If this story touches you, please subscribe and share the video to help me grow better. In Maine, the days took on a new rhythm. It was a rhythm dictated by the tides, not by deadlines. I woke with the sun, drank my coffee on the porch, watching the lobster boats head out, and took long walks along the rocky coastline. I was 1,400 miles away from the chaos, and the distance felt like a different universe. The quiet was absolute. It was the kind of quiet that lets you hear yourself think for the first time in years. The fallout began within days. I didn't seek out the news, but it found me anyway. In quiet. Clinical updates from Sarah. His company's primary bank just flagged his accounts for an internal audit. She told me over the phone one afternoon. Her voice was calm, professional. When you moved your assets, it must have triggered a dozen liquidity alarms. The bank got nervous. It seems his business was more leveraged against your personal wealth than we thought. I pictured my father in a boardroom, his usual confidence gone, trying to explain to a team of auditors why his financial foundation had suddenly vanished. He had built a house of cards on my stability, and I had just pulled out the bottom card. Then came the social media collapse. Chloe's online presence was a carefully curated fantasy of luxury brunches, designer bags, and exotic vacations. Her entire identity was built on a lifestyle she hadn't earned. But the internet is brutal. Someone must have talked. A whisper from a disgruntled employee at my father's firm. Maybe. Or a friend she had bragged to. The comments on her popular Instagram page started to turn. Debt? I thought you were rich. Didn't her sister pay for all that stuff? Heard she got cut off. Enjoying that Chanel bag. Hope it was worth $800K. The post stopped. Her vibrant, colorful page went silent. The luxury facade had crumbled, revealing the ugly, desperate truth underneath. Sarah told me that Justin had vanished. His text to Chloe simply said he was going on a business trip and needed some space. He had been a partner in her fantasy, but he had no interest in being a partner in her reality. Creditors started calling my father's office, then his home. The polite requests for payment turned into aggressive, relentless demands. They were no longer dealing with a powerful man who could make problems disappear. They were dealing with a debtor. His silence, once a tool of intimidation, was now the heavy silence of shame. I felt a strange sense of detachment from it all. It was like reading a story about people I used to know. There was no satisfaction, no triumphant feeling of revenge. There was only a quiet, sad sense of inevitability. This was always going to happen. I hadn't caused the collapse. I had just stopped preventing it. I had let gravity do its work. One evening, I was sitting on a large, smooth rock overlooking the ocean. The waves crashed against the shore in a steady, powerful rhythm. They were relentless, unfailing, and completely predictable. For years, I had been the opposite. I had been the wall that held back the tide of their consequences. I had absorbed the chaos. I had buffered them from their own choices. Now, I was sitting on a rented porch, watching waves instead of chaos. I had chosen the rhythm of the ocean over the noise of their lives. The price of their stability had been my peace, and I had finally decided to pay myself back. A week after the box, Sarah called with another update. Her voice was calm as always. "He's unraveling, Elena," she said. "He put the house on the market. Not Chloe's house. His own. The big one in the suburbs. And he's selling the sedan." I listened, picturing the house I grew up in, the manicured lawn, the oversized rooms filled with things meant to impress people. It was a stage, and my father had been the lead actor. Now he was selling the set. "He needs to," I said, my voice quiet. It wasn't said with malice. It was a simple statement of fact. "You can't start over until you hit the bottom." "I agree," Sarah said. "Just wanted you to know the firewall is holding. A few of their creditors tried to come after your LLC, but the paperwork is ironclad. You're untouchable." Untouchable. The word hung in the air after we hung up. For so long, I had been the most touchable person in their lives. Always available. Always accessible. Always there to solve the problem. Being untouchable felt like a superpower. Then a week later, my phone rang. It was an unknown number with a familiar area code. My first instinct was to ignore it. I had become fiercely protective of my newfound peace. But something made me answer. I pressed the phone to my ear without saying anything. For a few seconds, there was only the sound of breathing on the other end. Then a voice. "Elena?" It was my father. But it wasn't his voice. The command was gone. The arrogance was gone. It was quiet. Stripped bare. It was the voice of a man who had lost everything, including his illusions. I waited. "We need to talk," he said. It wasn't a demand. It sounded like a plea. "There's nothing to talk about, Dad," I said. My voice was even. Not cold, just factual. There was a long pause. I could hear the faint sound of cars in the background on his end. He was probably sitting in his half-empty house, the movers having already taken the expensive furniture. "You embarrassed me," he admitted. And I heard a flicker of the old Robert Vance. "You aired all our dirty laundry for the world to see. You dirtied the laundry," I replied calmly. "I just stopped washing it for you." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't angry. It was defeated. I heard him take a shaky breath. "You were right," he finally whispered. The words sounded like they were being pulled from him, heavy and painful in the box. The note. All of it. I was never saving the family. I was controlling it. I was managing assets. And you. You were my best one. It was the most honest, ugly thing he had ever said to me. And in its own twisted way, it was the closest he'd ever come to telling me my value. Something inside me, a hard knot of resentment I had carried for decades, softened. It wasn't forgiveness. It was just a release. "You taught me business, Dad," I said quietly, the ocean roaring softly in the background. "You taught me how to read a balance sheet and how to spot a bad investment. But you never taught me about love." His voice, when he finally spoke, was thick with something I couldn't identify. Regret. Maybe. Or just the exhaustion of a man who had run out of lies. "I'm learning now," he whispered, and then he hung up. I stood there on my porch, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt a profound, aching sadness for the man who had to lose a fortune just to learn the value of a daughter. 3 months later, Maine had become home. The rented cottage was now mine, bought with cash. The ocean was loud, but the quiet inside of me was louder. I had found a new rhythm, one that belonged only to me. I started teaching free financial literacy workshops for women in the local community center. The room was always full. It was filled with daughters, sisters, and wives who, in one way or another, had all been trained to fix everyone else's messes before their own. They were women who had been told that wanting financial independence was selfish. They were women who had co-signed on loans for bad news boyfriends, who had emptied their savings for troubled siblings, who had put their family's needs so far ahead of their own that they had forgotten they had any. I taught them about budgeting, about investing, about setting up LLCs to protect their assets. But mostly, I taught them about boundaries. "Your money is a tool," I'd tell them, looking out at their eager, tired faces. "It's a tool to build a life for yourself. It is not an obligation you owe to anyone who shares your last name." When I told them, Sometimes walking away is the most generous thing you can do for yourself and for them. They would nod. They would nod because they knew. They knew the exhaustion of being the strong one. They understood the crushing weight of being the endless safety net. In that small, dusty room, we weren't strangers. We were survivors. I was healing myself by helping them learn how to heal themselves. One afternoon, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but not the same one as before. I answered. Elena. The voice was hesitant, uncertain. It was Chloe. Hi, Chloe, I said, my voice neutral. Hi, she said. I know you probably don't want to hear from me. I'm listening, I said. I could hear her take a deep breath. I got a job, she said. I'm a receptionist at a dentist's office. It doesn't pay much, but it's mine. The humility in her voice was staggering. The Chloe I knew wouldn't have been able to admit to such a normal, unglamorous job. Justin left, she added almost as an afterthought. He cleaned out the joint bank account. I guess I had that coming. I'm sorry to hear that, I said. And I meant it. Don't be, she said quickly. It's okay. It's hard, but it's real. I wanted to say thank you. I was confused. For what? Her voice cracked just a little. For not saving me, she said. For not giving Dad the money. If you had, I'd still be with Justin. We'd still be lying and spending. And it would have gotten worse. This is the first time in my entire life that I've had to be a grown-up. And it's terrifying. But it's mine. She paused. Thank you for letting me fail. I closed my eyes. All those years, I thought saving her was my job. I thought that was what love was. And here she was, thanking me for finally letting her go. And for the first time, her words didn't sound like a manipulation. They sounded like forgiveness. Weeks later, a postcard arrived in my mailbox. The picture on the front was of a faded fishing dock somewhere in Florida. It was the kind of cheap, flimsy card you buy at a gas station. I turned it over. The handwriting was my father's, but it was uneven, shaky. It looked like the writing of an old man. The message was only a few words. You were right. I taught you profit, not peace. Learning now. Proud of you. Dad? Proud of you. 3 words I had spent my entire life trying to earn. 3 words that had always been reserved for Chloe's imaginary accomplishments. And now here they were, written on the back of a cheap postcard. They had arrived long after I had stopped needing to hear them, which I realized was the only reason I could finally believe them. I took the postcard inside and pinned it to the corkboard above my desk. It wasn't a trophy. It wasn't a prize. It was just a quiet acknowledgement. A period at the end of a very long sentence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I pulled on a sweater and walked down to the beach. The moon was full, casting a silver path across the dark water. The air was cool and sharp, and the only sound was the constant rhythmic crash and retreat of the waves against the rocks. I walked along the shoreline for a long time, the cool wind curling around me. I thought about the box, the phone calls, the postcard. I thought about the woman who had packed a suitcase in the middle of the night and the woman who was standing here now. They were the same person, but they were also completely different. For so many years, my life had been about them, their drama, their needs, their chaos. I had defined myself by my role in their lives. The savior, the provider, the strong one. Now standing here with nothing but the sound of the sea for company, I felt the vast empty space where all that obligation used to be. And it wasn't empty at all. It was filled with peace. The waves whispered against the rocks, a sound that has existed for millions of years and will exist for millions more. It was a sound that knew nothing of debt or family or guilt. I took a deep breath of the salty air and whispered back into the wind. You can't lose what finally set you free. There were no tears. There was no lingering guilt. There was only the powerful, steady sound of the sea and the quiet, unshakable freedom that doesn't need anyone's permission to exist. I opened the front door before they had a chance to ring the bell. Come in, I said. They walked inside, their steps hesitant on the polished concrete floors. Their eyes darted everywhere, taking in the open-plan living space, the huge fireplace, the original artwork on the walls, the vast lake visible through the wall of glass. Their awe was palpable, and underneath it, I could smell something else, the scent of greed. Their minds were already racing, calculating, reevaluating my worth to them. Eleanor, my mother said, her voice breathy. This house? Where did all this come from? I've been fortunate in my work, I said simply, leading them to the living room. I did not offer them a tour. I did not offer them drinks. This was not a social gathering. It was a final board meeting. They sat uncomfortably on the low, modern sofa. They looked small and out of place. For a few minutes, they tried to lecture me. My father took the lead, his voice attempting its usual booming authority, but it was hollow in the high-ceilinged room. Eleanor, we are here because we are worried, he began. What you did to Victoria was cruel and unnecessary. Families are supposed to support each other, to forgive each other. Money, he gestured vaguely at the house. My mother chimed in. Your sister made a mistake. She was under a lot of pressure at work. You have to find it in your heart to forgive her and to help her. She lost her job because of you. They spoke for 10 minutes. I let them. I listened quietly as they told me about forgiveness, loyalty, and the unbreakable bonds of family. I listened to all the beautiful words they had never once put into practice. When they were finished, a heavy silence fell. They looked at me expecting an apology, expecting me to break down, to promise to make everything right, to restore the comfortable order of their world. Instead, I reached for a thin folder I had placed on the coffee table. I opened it. "I agree," I said, my voice calm and clear. "We should settle things." I looked directly at my younger sister. "Isabella, let's start with the family trust. The one Grandpa Arthur set up for our education." Isabella shifted nervously. "What about it?" "I did a full audit last week," I said. "I found some interesting invoices. For example, several from a company called Art Supplies Unlimited over the past 2 years, totaling over $30,000. The strange thing is, according to state business records, Art Supplies Unlimited doesn't exist." I slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a copy of a forged invoice. "You've been stealing from the family, Isabella, for 2 years. You've been siphoning money that was meant for all of us." Isabella's charming smile vanished. Her face went pale, then blotchy red. She looked at our parents for help, but they were staring at her in stunned, horrified silence. The darling of the family was a common thief. I then turned my gaze to my parents. "You want to talk about family? About support? For 40 years. You have treated me like a piece of furniture. You celebrated Victoria's ambition and Isabella's charm. And you ignored me because I was quiet. You taught me that my worth in this family was based on how little space I took up. You didn't build a family. You built a hierarchy based on your own preferences." I looked at all three of them, their faces a mixture of shock, shame, and disbelief. "This isn't a family," I said, my voice steady and final. "It's a failed business. It's bankrupt. Morally bankrupt. And I'm liquidating my shares." I stood up. They remained seated, frozen on the couch. "That means I'm done. I'm withdrawing my time, my energy, and my love. The accounts are closed." I turned and walked away toward the large glass windows overlooking the lake. I didn't tell them to leave. I didn't need to. The meeting was over. Their presence in my house, in my life, was over. I listened as moments later I heard the sound of the front door opening and then closing for the last time. Months later, the sunlight was warm on the back of my neck. I pressed my hands into the rich, dark soil, firming it around the base of a young maple tree. The air smelled of damp earth and new beginnings. In the distance, I could hear the sound of children's laughter drifting through the crisp autumn air. I was in the Higgins and Arthur Memorial Garden. It was a small public park, a patch of green and quiet in the middle of the city. I had bought the derelict lot it stood on and funded its creation. There were flower beds and benches, a small playground, and a community reading circle. It was named for the two people who had, in their own ways, given me my freedom: Mrs. Higgins, whose simple need for kindness had been my breaking point, and Grandpa Arthur, who had given me the key to unlock my own life. Mrs. Higgins was sitting on a bench near the playground. reading a story to a group of neighborhood children. She was warm and safe, her new furnace long since installed, her winters now comfortable. After her landlord had tried to evict her, I had bought her building, lowered the rents for all the elderly tenants, and funded a proper maintenance program. It was a small thing, really, a footnote in the Orion Fund's portfolio, but it felt more real than any billion-dollar acquisition. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a news alert. Apex Financial Group announces record quarter, following major restructuring. Michael Ross had kept his job. The bank had survived. My paused withdrawal had forced them to clean house, to trim the fat, to actually pay attention to their culture. They were stronger for it. I never heard from Victoria again. I heard through the grapevine that she had moved to another state, taking a much lower-level job at a small credit union. Isabella had quietly paid back the money she had stolen. My parents sent a single, stiff letter asking for a reconciliation, which I never answered. They were ghosts from a former life. The transfer of $4.2 billion was the loudest thing I had ever done. But it wasn't my greatest act. The real act of power, the one that truly changed my life, was the quiet withdrawal of my love and my loyalty from people who had bankrupted my spirit. I had spent a lifetime making deposits into a family account that gave me nothing in return. Closing it was the single most profitable transaction I ever made. I stood up and brushed the dirt from my hands, looking at the small, hopeful maple tree. It would grow tall here. It would be seen. I looked out at the peaceful garden, at the smiling faces, and felt a sense of quiet contentment that no amount of money could ever buy. If you've ever been mocked for being small, if you've ever been made to feel invisible, remember this. Silence isn't weakness. It's leverage. Like, comment, and subscribe because the best revenge is quiet freedom.